10 days, and I think there was a bit of an expectation that the matter was going to be solved quickly.
Norfolk Island is very strictly immigration controlled, so within a very short time we had a list of everyone who was on the island that day. Extrapolating from that, the name of the murderer must have been on that list.
The investigation is given the title Operation Dunedin, and its first priority is to perform an autopsy.
There's an anklet, gold in colour.
There are a lot of superficial cuts about a face and about the front of the neck. There was some on the right shoulder as well. And those injuries were caused by a sharp object like a knife or a broken piece of bottle with an assailant coming up very close and cutting the skin.
The knife wounds include a deep slash across her face and a stab wound in her eye that fractured her skull.
She had several lacerations or injuries where the skin tears about the head region, and we found fragments of glass in her hair. And I think that those injuries came about by being struck with an object, a blunt object such as a bottle or a vase or something like that.
As well as the glass fragments, some flecks of white and green paint are found on her body. The injuries extend from her head to her feet, and she has a number of broken bones, including a dislocated ankle and a fractured pelvis.
Then there were other injuries. There were grazes on her back region. There were bruises in many areas of the body. There were round grip marks on an arm near the wrist, making me think that at some stage during this assault, somebody had grabbed her wrist and tried to restrain her.
Although Janelle's clothes had been neatly cut away from her body, there was no evidence that she'd been raped.
There were cuts to her lower legs, just above the ankle region, made with a sharp weapon like a knife again. There were multiple abrasions on the knees. There were other bruises to the sides of the body, and there were other marks to her back, a combination of abrasions and bruises that had a somewhat distinctive appearance and made me think that possibly a rod or something like a tyre lever might have been used to inflict some of those injuries.
The wounds clearly indicate a savage and sustained attack lasting up to 10 minutes, during which time she fought back fiercely. For this reason, Dr. Carla suspects that only one attacker was involved, because two or more would be expected to have overpowered her sooner.
The fatal wound, of course, ignoring all these other injuries, was a stab wound to the left side of the chest, which entered the left lung and exited, and in fact struck the left side of the chest cage.
6 days after the murder, a memorial service is held.
The church was full to overflowing. And it's manifested itself, I should say, in so many ways like that, where when something happens in the community, it just clicks together like a well-oiled machine.
Australian Federal Police detectives have been sent to Norfolk Island to help with the investigation into the murder of 29-year-old Janelle Patton. The early days of the investigation are taken up with tracking Janelle's last hours alive, examining the area where her body was found, and establishing the approximate time that she was left there.
That afternoon there'd been a really heavy rainstorm, around 3:30, 3:45. It was not uncommon on Norfolk, but this one was torrential. It lasted 15 minutes, but the amount of water that fell was phenomenal.
When Senior Constable Julius first arrived at the scene, he noticed that there were pools of water on the plastic, in areas of the plastic, which suggested that the body had been placed there before the rain.
In mid-afternoon, some local surfers take advantage of the wet grassy slopes to ride their boogie boards.
They brought the video camera in and the videotape in, and we hooked it up and I watched it, and you could see the body of Janelle in the corner of a few of the frames. So that, again, that was date and time stamped, so that gave us a time that the body was there.
Detective Bob Peters believes the killer's choice of both time and place for abandoning the body are highly significant.
Possibly that a partner was coming home from wherever, or people were due around to visit, so they had to take the risk of moving it in daylight rather than night time. And night time in Norfolk Island is a particularly dark situation and a lot less likely to be caught.
The torrential rain has washed the site clean, possibly removing blood, footprints or other evidence. The plastic is sent to Australia, where police find 10 smudged partial fingerprints. Because there were only slightly more than 2,700 people on the island that day, police ask all islanders to volunteer to be fingerprinted and submit DNA. About 1,300 agree.
I'm pretty sure that the response we got on Norfolk Island would outstrip any kind of response we would get in a city on the mainland, for example.
The mass fingerprinting is a huge undertaking, requiring a team of specialised operators from Canberra to be flown to the island. To quickly locate possible witnesses and even establish alibis, everyone is asked to complete an initial written survey, listing their movements on Easter Sunday.
So that again gave us ways of linking people to places and timings and different areas, and putting people with other people at particular times as well.
The police begin retracing Janelle's activities on the Sunday morning and identifying anyone who might have seen her. They delve into Janelle's life on the island and interview all her friends and her former lovers. They must also look into the apparent coincidence of Janelle being murdered about 24 hours after her parents arrived on the island. While Ron and Carol are quickly eliminated, Peters compiles a lengthy list of people who'd had some contact with Janelle. Peters begins to get the first inkling of the distinctive nature of Norfolk Island society and how difficult this investigation is going to be.
I don't think anyone from outside could give you a good assessment of what Norfolk Island's really about after a couple of years, even after a number of years. It's a fairly unique sort of a place. In some regards, it's a little bit like a small rural community, but they're surrounded by ocean with no road going in or out. The islanders are helpful and cooperative with the police, but like all small communities, for all the outward kindness and sociability, Norfolk has its simmering rivalries, petty feuds and jealousies. There are some accusations that some locals are using the investigation as a chance to settle old scores, but police dismiss such claims. During the next 2 years, Peters conducts thousands of hours of painstaking investigation. He gradually comes to focus on 16 persons of interest, people he believes could have had a motive. Some, like Ron and Carol, are quickly cleared, but others, including a number of Janelle's friends and former lovers, require closer examination. Eventually, Peters reaches the point where there is nothing new to add to the investigation. He's convinced that someone on the island must be hiding the killer's identity. And this was an attack that happened in broad daylight, in a place where if you sneeze at 2:30 in the morning, people quite often tell you that you need some medication when they see you at 8 o'clock in the morning. The case is sent to the ACT and Norfolk Island Chief Magistrate Ron Carl. Exactly 2 years after the murder, the coronial inquest opens in the Norfolk Courthouse at the Colonial Military Barracks. There is distress for Janelle's family and friends when every detail of her love life is bared in open court.
We had to put up with negatives. I think they were blown out of all proportion. I think if you were to look at people of her age group at that time and their behaviour and what they were doing, it wasn't that much different from what her age group was doing.
The inquest reaches a climax when the coroner uses a rare tactic trying to break the case open. He releases Detective Sergeant Peter's report, which names 10 persons of interest.
But it's certainly caused a lot of heartache and a lot of finger pointing and major problems for the island as everyone was looking over their shoulders and pointing fingers at each other.
Not only do the police not have the usual single suspect on whom they can concentrate and gather evidence, Peters is forced to admit that there's a wide range of possible motives. But one thing is clear: nothing in her relationships with each of the persons of interest can remotely explain the ferocity and passion of the attack on Janelle.
From a clinical point of view, the disputes that she'd had with people, I couldn't see as being sufficient that would trip somebody over the edge.
After 4 days reviewing the evidence, Coroner Ron Carl handed down an open finding.
So I don't regard the matter of not uncovering the perpetrator as a failure, but just a step in a long and hard process.
To try to flush out new information, a $300,000 reward is offered. But the naming of the persons of interest will produce nothing, and the islanders will demand an apology because when the killer is finally caught, he is not one of the named persons, and yet he has been interviewed by police. And his fingerprints are sitting in a file, waiting to be uncovered and linked to the murder. The investigation into Janelle Patton's murder has lasted 2 years, and police are still no closer to finding the killer. The coronial inquest has released the names of key people who've been investigated, but there's no firm evidence to link any of them to the killing. The breakthrough comes soon after the inquest is completed, when police decide to conduct a thorough review of all the evidence. Among the files is a set of fingerprints from a New Zealander, Glenn McNeil, who was working on the island as a chef at the time of the murder. His prints had been taken when he was interviewed about a minor break-and-enter case. During the interview, McNeil was also questioned about his whereabouts on Easter Sunday. He gave police an alibi for the time of Janelle's murder, and 10 days after that interview, he left the island. About a year later, Bob Peters came across the fingerprints, still sitting in the break-and-enter file, and he sent them to Canberra for testing. At first, they did not match the prints on the black plastic sheeting.
It was originally considered to be another part of his hand, so the comparison didn't match up. And then they looked at the fingerprints again and realised that what they thought was one part of a finger turned out to be another part of a finger. And then they identified it as Mr. McNeil's.
Peters is wary. He knows there could be many reasons for people to have touched the plastic before the murder.
I'd been on the roller coaster so many times that I refused to get myself too excited. I thought, well, okay, so he's touched the plastic. Let's see where it takes us from there.
In his interview about the break-and-enter, McNeil had told police he was at home on Sunday. He claimed to have had a number of phone calls with his wife, who was at work. His wife had confirmed she'd made the call and that he'd driven to the hotel to bring her a cut lunch.
I then got access to his, by warrant, to his old telephone records and established that there was no such phone call from the hotel to their house that day, which cast considerable doubt on her alibi for him.
The police then discovered that McNeil's marriage had broken up soon after the murder. They also found that he'd owned a white four-door Honda car